Hi, I'm Olivia. Welcome back to our NTP podcast. Today, our Civic Forum was on immigration, and we had really fruitful debate, discussion, deliberation. To speak more about it, I'm going to hand the mic off to our speaker today.
Hi, I'm Felipe Hoz with Documented. I'm a reporter who covers immigration, just here with this group of civically engaged high school students to talk a little bit more about immigration and expand on the conversation we had earlier. So,
Yeah.
Do I introduce myself? Okay, so on the issue of immigration, one particular topic that the president brought up himself was about the birthright citizenship, and from what I'm getting, this is what I'm interpreting because I know a couple of very avid Trump supporters, and they do look at these things very intently, and what they say and what I believe is happening, I believe he is amounting birthright citizenship as a possible solution to the issue of immigration. And I wanted to ask you, could you perhaps clarify that? Is there actually a practical solution to it through birthright citizenship based on what the president is proposing? So I just wanted to ask your input on that.
So the first thing I want to say is that birthright citizenship, as it's currently constituted in law, is part of the... I'll just start the answer again. I think the sort of main point to hit on this is that birthright citizenship is not a U.S. law or regulation. It's part of the U.S. Constitution, the 14th Amendment. Contrary to what some folks have said about litigating it in the courts, I mean, it has been litigated in the case of Wong Kim Ark versus United States in the late 19th century. That was kind of stemming from the Chinese Exclusion Act, where people that were natural-born U.S. citizens but of Chinese origin had to essentially prove that they were citizens somehow when re-entering the country, and this gentleman was denied entry. And the Supreme Court affirmed that, the U.S. Constitution says that everyone born in the United States is a U.S. citizen. So I think it would be very difficult practically for them to change that. It would probably have to be a constitutional amendment, or they would have to get the Supreme Court to overturn it, which is very difficult based on the precedent, though not impossible now with the two conservative judges that have been recently appointed. As far as just mainly the policy in general, I don't think it makes a lot of sense, right? Because, the United States has always kind of been predicated on that ideal, for the last century and a half, at least since that decision. Sometimes the president does say things along the lines of, other countries don't do this. That's not true. About 30 other countries do it. It is true that some of the other developed countries don't do it, but that doesn't, I don't think that necessarily means that it hasn't worked out for the United States. I don't know if you had...
I have a follow-up question. So on the topic of birthright citizenship, do you not think that, I guess, a lot of mothers that are crossing the borders just to have their babies in the United States, do you not think that poses an extreme risk to those people that are crossing the border, an extreme risk to the baby? And do you not think that having birthright citizenship as a part of the Constitution, having that as an option, do you not think that that is a little bit it's an incentive for people to risk not just their lives, but their babies' lives to cross the border illegally and have a baby just so that they can stay in the United States and that their baby can have citizenship?
So on that point, I would say it's relatively rare that occurs. People that are pregnant typically aren't necessarily able to make the grueling journey that is required to actually arrive at the border. I think some of the irony, the irony isn't lost on me here that there's actually a pretty thriving birth tourism industry for wealthy people from mainly Russia and China that travel to the United States for that exact purpose, but of course do so on a jetliner and live in luxury until they have their children. In terms of incentive structures, I think, from the conversations that I've had, that may enter someone's mind, but someone's decision to enter the United States is predicated on a bunch of different factors, and in that constellation of decision making, I don't think that question is probably the most salient at any given time. People come with their small children, who they know are going to be themselves undocumented, but partly it's sort of a reaction to try to get out of the perceived sense of imminent harm that they might be facing at home.
onto that, like a very different from that point, but in terms of the U.S. has a history of foreign intervention that oftentimes causes the refugee crises in Latin America and in the Middle East, creating power vacuums. To what extent does the U.S. have an obligation to help to accept these refugees, or does our legislation, represent this?
Well, I mean, in terms of the obligation, the U.S. has an obligation to allow anybody that's fleeing any kind of persecution to request asylum. So, I mean, that sort of takes care of that. In terms of, like, if they have a specific obligation because of their foreign interventions, I don't think I can say with specificity. I mean, I think that comes down to kind of your moral valuation. It is undeniable that some of the situations that have caused people from especially the Northern Triangle in Central America to arrive at the United States were engineered covertly or overtly by the United States over the, mid to late 20th century. And so I think the premise is correct, that that's definitely something that needs to be litigated. I don't know that I can say from a moral standpoint what the solution is, but from a legal standpoint, it's certainly very clear that if someone's being persecuted based on the factors that fall under asylum petitions, they have to be admitted to the United States. Anyone else?
I have a question. So living in New York, I know we really come from the perspective of somebody who's surrounded by a bunch of different cultures at all times. How do you respond to not the federal intervention, but the cities who really help ICE, and support ICE, even going as far as to sometimes getting a little bit unconstitutional? How do you think that cities and states should regulate around ICE, and aid/refute aid to them?
Sure. I think the question of kind of cities' cooperation with federal enforcement is fascinating. I think it's one that's poorly understood. I mean, we hear the term sanctuary cities, right? And I think some people believe that means that cities actively shield their undocumented populations from ICE. That doesn't happen. All that a sanctuary city means is that they do not actively cooperate, but there's no way that they can, stop federal agents from arresting anyone. With regards to cities that actively cooperate, well, first of all, I want to mention that, there was some discussion earlier about kind of cities being forced to cooperate through the disbursement of grants or whatnot. This past week, a federal judge actually ruled that it was unconstitutional for the federal government to hold criminal justice grants hostage as a result of non-cooperation. So at least the courts so far have sided with municipalities that want to assert their right not to cooperate. In terms of cooperation, it runs the gamut. I mean, some of them, it can go anywhere from, officers that voluntarily check IDs or whatever to what's called the 287G agreement, which is as a type of memorandum of understanding between the federal government and a local police department where it actually deputizes local police officers, actually mostly corrections officers, to run immigration checks and arrest someone on behalf of ICE. And the way it's framed typically is as a public safety thing. I think that the arguments and the evidence against basically showing that people, if they're the victim of a crime, won't go to court to report that crime or to be a witness in the case if they know that there's a risk that they might be arrested. People do not trust the police. And I don't think it's subjective to say that kind of cooperation harms, obviously, the collaboration between certain undocumented communities and the police, and by extension, arguably makes everyone less safe. And so if what we're talking about is public safety here, I think having a situation where a portion of your population can't rely on the criminal justice system, or at least feels that they can't rely on the criminal justice system, endangers them and endangers people that, that have nothing to do with that, maybe they're going to be victimized by somebody that wasn't arrested the first time because they decided not to go to the police. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of my view on it.
Well, I agree with most of that argument. I just don't see how the argument of we shouldn't enforce the laws as much, or we shouldn't really. ICE as a whole of an organization isn't really the best. The way it was made, the way it was created, and how it came to be. But the argument that we shouldn't enforce the law because then the undocumented immigrants would then be scared to go to any law enforcement, just it's kind of wonky, because then does that not mean that if someone robs a bank or something like that and we don't enforce a law on them, they're not going to go to law enforcement either if they see something else because they're wanted by law enforcement? So does that mean that we should just not enforce the law because it would let that entire community be scared of law enforcement? Or do you think there's a medium that needs to be found where undocumented immigrants, if ICE or any type of police or force finds them, that they would be, I guess, brought to justice under current law, but we would still maintain the communication with the police force?
Cool. So I would say, in terms of enforcing the law, I would say that in this question specifically of kind of like police and whatnot, there are different sets of laws. So if a local police department decides not to cooperate with federal law enforcement, they're not neglecting to enforce the laws that they've been sworn to enforce, which are local laws, governing criminal behavior and whatnot. And there's no federal law forcing local police officers or peace officers of any kind to cooperate with federal law enforcement. There are laws that try to tie cooperation to benefits like grant disbursements, although that might get ruled unconstitutional soon. As far as kind of the framework of the discussion, I think it comes down at this point to more of a practical argument, right? If that's, if we're going to talk about what the practical thing to do is, if you already have a certain population that's like living in a section of your city, right, and that is undocumented, and they're at that point completely intertwined with the rest of the city. I mean, they're not differentiated in any way except for the fact that they're undocumented. It becomes a very thorny question about, if you start targeting that group to enforce the law, that you are helping enforce a federal law, but are you kind of eroding trust in your local institutions and by extension making everything else at the municipal level work worse? So and that doesn't extend just to public safety. I mean, people, right now there's something called the public charge rule, which is being debated at the federal level, which would make it so that if people receive certain kinds of non-cash public benefits, they might get denied for like green cards or certain visa statuses. And so that one is like a great example of, the people that will be affected might not just be undocumented people, right? If somebody doesn't get a vaccine because they think it's going to affect their immigration status in some way, the virus doesn't care if if you're a citizen or if you're a resident. There are certain macro effects that you have to have, keep in consideration, I think.
Actually, just kind of going off of that idea, I guess you could say, from what you're saying, yes, obviously undocumented immigrants are a very integral part of American economy and also our society. But I think a big argument that's kind of present in today's climate, especially from the right, is saying that by not enforcing, not taking that next step to enforce the laws and regulations that we have, we're in a kind of a byproduct of that is incentivizing this kind of disregardment of immigration policy. So in terms of that argument, I wanted to know your input on that and your opinion on that.
Sure. I think that's a great question. And I think, like a lot of these things, it's very complicated to game out what's going to happen when you do something. So, for example, I mentioned earlier the hardening of the border that occurred post 9/11, right? And so if you just hear that, they're going to harden the border, kind of your innate thought would be that that's going to decrease illegal immigration. There will be less undocumented people, right? That's kind of the, just seems like what would happen. The reverse happened because it was getting harder to cross back and forth. People that had already crossed just stayed, right? Whereas before they would have, they would only come to the United States for work. Now, the situation was such that they just stayed put. And anyone that sort of managed and had any intentions of maybe living as an undocumented person no longer had any incentive to ever leave. And so I'm not saying, those kinds of consequences. I'm not saying that, there isn't an incentive structure in place, but it tends to be a little less clear cut than just, you do A and B will happen, because these are such complex systems, with so many different factors. But, I think that, I think that if you incentivize certain behavior, that behavior probably will manifest. But it's also a question of, are people incentivizing undocumented immigration while saying that they want to disincentivize it? Like when I said, when I was talking about the kind of business owners and stuff, they will oftentimes facilitate that migration while saying that, they would like it to stop, and so I think there's kind of another layer of that.
You can go.
Go for it. I'm a little curious actually. What kind of incentives? Like we're talking about like incentives to bring people and like to tell people to like step up or like go out and in, and like what kind of incentives do you think that would be really helpful to like specifically, like for the future, for like new ideas, new policies, and things like that?
Sure, but just. It depends what you're trying to incentivize. Would you be trying in this case to disincentivize migration, incentivize more legal migration? What would?
Incentivize more legal migration and decentivizing illegal unauthorized entry, because then you would help kind of get both sides of the party happy.
So if the objective is to disincentivize illegal immigration, I think one very easy thing that could be done right now is, in terms of the asylum process, the authorities in the San Ysidro port of entry right now, for example, and across the southern border, are essentially only allowing very limited numbers of people to tender their legal right to an asylum hearing at a time. And there's like 2,000 people in this one shelter, and they're letting in like 100 people at a time, right? And so what that does is, like, if you're in a camp in northern Mexico and there's no food and it rains every day and you have like a kid, are you going to wait 3 months, for the asylum officers to decide that they're going to allow you to tender a claim? No, most people end up crossing, because once you've crossed, then you can immediately tender an asylum case because you're in the United States. And so I think that would just be like a really easy way for that to be fixed. And I think, a cynical person would say that this is being done intentionally because there is the capacity to process more people, but they don't want to because A, they just don't want that many people to have, the administration doesn't want that many people to be able to tender asylum claims. And B, if they incentivize illegal immigration, then they can point to that and say, look, we're giving these people the opportunity to enter legally, and they're choosing to enter illegally, and, blah, blah, blah. So that would be a really easy one. In general, like across the board, that's one specific thing. I think across the board, you would just have to make it so that, a system that maybe incentivizes something beyond. Our system is very family reunification focused right now. I think like 75% of all green cards, I don't know the exact number, but something like that. I think it's over 50 per year are family reunification based, right? And so, at the same time, our refugee admissions are now capped at 25,000, which is the lowest number since the program was started. And so, like, if you start cutting away other ways for people to into the country, I think that, you would just want to have a system where there were more options as to, it wasn't just maybe employment, or you have a family member, maybe have an expanded lottery, which there is a limited version of now, and that sort of thing.
So one of my favorite parts of your presentation was talking about the economic side to immigration, and I think a lot of misconceptions that are perpetuated through the media and through, the current presidency is that immigrants are really hurting the American workforce. I mean, to anyone that's joining our podcast that hadn't seen your presentation, could you elaborate on the, the stats and the facts and the figures related to that? Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So I also wanted to bring up, I was reading an interesting bunch of articles that were sent to me. They were talking about how mass migration as a whole, so like the amount of refugees and immigrants that we are letting into the country, hurts not just regular American workers, but like socioeconomic, like low-income workers who work in the bodegas like you talked about, or work in, the farms and stuff that are here, that are citizens of the United States that need to find jobs that can't because there are so many other workers coming in, whether legally or illegally, that are taking these low-skill, low-income jobs away from the people that are already here. So,
Like that.
yeah.
Sure.
Nice.
So kind of like answer both those. In terms of, for certain industries, it is true that local employers cannot find local people to do them. And I know that because, as I mentioned in my presentation, I was just at some farms, talked to construction managers or whatever. They just they can't fill their slots. In terms of like a more macro, short term, when there's a large influx of immigrants short term, there tends to be a slight depression in wages, perhaps. But for some economies, especially, and I kind of want to, since this is a civic forum, we're talking about all kinds of civic issues. One of the issues right now is like cities around the country where their manufacturing industries have collapsed and the tax base is eroding and birth rates are low and yada yada yada, and they're kind of doing pretty poorly economically. Some have seen a revitalization based on immigrants. So right here in New York State, Buffalo, for example, was hemorrhaging local population. The tax base was collapsing. It was pretty bleak. And then I think maybe like 8 years ago, I want to say, or something like that, there was this sudden influx of refugees that were resettled in Buffalo, a lot of them arriving at once. And people in Buffalo, civic leaders and local elected officials and whatnot, actually kind of credit that population growth with kind of getting some of the local economy back on track. So I think it's not just a subject in isolation. It's also kind of like with regards to the United States' own dropping birth rates and kind of the depopulation of cities across both the Midwest and the South and wherever. I think that comes into play. Yeah.
Yeah, I have another one. Okay. So I think just going off of the theme of just huge, vast misconceptions about immigrants and the nature of being undocumented in a big city in the United States. I mean, this is kind of going off of your profession and your journalism. How do you think that we start to have conversations about that and start to correct the image of undocumented citizens through their stories? Essentially, I'm asking you, how do you do your job?
That's a good question.
Even the word illegal, attaches this stigma.
You can add it on. Go ahead.
Because during our discussion, during our deliberation, like people who were in my group, like something that was, hello. One of the things that came up, it came up briefly, but it was something that was rather emphasized on, like what is like the proper label to put on the undocumented immigrants, because like one person would say illegal immigrant, the other person would say undocumented immigrant, and I guess one of our supervisors there, she had said it's like an incentive to give respect to them to say undocumented instead of illegal, more so as like a humanity thing, and so I just wanted to ask you about that. So.
Just like adding on the stigma attached to the word, illegal or alien. How do you, as times do your job in terms of addressing those stereotypes and those stigmas, or trying to stop the perpetuation of them?
Yeah. So that's actually it's kind of an interesting question for a couple of reasons. First of all, I don't like the word illegal because I think it's an ugly term, but also it's not actually quite accurate all the time. I mean, technically, okay, everyone who's in violation of immigration laws is in violation of immigration laws, but the idea that everyone who is technically a criminal is actually incorrect, because civil immigration violations are civil law, and illegal entry is a criminal statute, but if you overstay your visa, technically speaking, you have not committed a federal crime or a crime of any kind. It's a civil violation. So I think definitely the language that's used shapes the narrative. And so I think that, using precise language is important, which is why I don't like some of these things. Just in general, in terms of, I just think it's like demystifying. I mean, like, they're not aliens like from outer space, right? I mean, it's like we have all these. There's like this boogeyman thing going on everywhere, and I think like a big part of the job is just to have an acknowledgement that they're people that have issues that are similar in some ways to everyone else's issues, and I do think also. A lot of data-driven stories are important, and it's important to know what is going on statistically and stuff. But you can't do this job without like literally speaking with immigrants, right? And I think sometimes that gets a little lost in maybe some of the national coverage. There's a lot of great reporters that do a lot of great work, but I think sometimes, especially like when something is like breaking, like right, and it's all of a sudden all these people that don't cover immigration flock to child shelters or the border or whatever. I think that there's a sense that what gets lost is that they're just humans interacting with their environs, and they have needs and whatnot. And I think we need to personalize that for it to ever get through, because that's if you even talk to people that are very hawkish on immigration and think that like all of the illegals should be deported and blah blah blah. I mean, it's funny, there's been these articles about all these people that said those things, and then they're like, Barber gets deported, and they're like, well, I didn't mean him, right? And so I think that like it's important that people understand that these are individuals.
Yeah. That's really something quickly. Yeah. Just to tie everything back to current events, I was just kind of wondering, obviously like immigration policy has been highly covered by the media as of recently because the current administration has such strong opinions towards it. And I was just wondering if like there's been a lot of coverage about policies like that have existed for a while prior to this administration, yet are being covered more now because of the current administration. And then also a lot of the times they quote the president's dictions rather than like what's actually going on in the government. So I just wanted to ask, like, maybe for some of our watchers and listeners who aren't as aware, what actually has been happening, what actions have been taken place, I guess, in the government, and what the effect of this, the measured effect thus far, the measured impact has been in the economy, in the kind of aspects that we've been talking about throughout this conversation. Yeah.
Because for me, that's a very obscure thing that has been going on ever since Trump became president. Like with all the coverage that he has by the media, I never hear anything about what orders that he's taken. Like, you actually do have to do some digging in order to actually find out anything about what he's done as president.
Sure, no, it's a terrific question. I mean, first of all, I would say that like I don't think anyone should just quote the president without context, because it doesn't mean like half of what he says, or he just says that we should do things that are illegal and we shouldn't just let him. But in general, I think just no laws have changed since he's been president with regards to immigration. They've tried to pass multiple laws, but none have passed. So everything that's happened so far is executive branch stuff. And a lot of it, they've tried to do a lot of regulatory things. A lot of it has been blocked in court. So, for example, DACA, they tried to rescind it, tied up in court. Temporary protected status, TPS, they've tried to rescind it, blocked in court. Travel bans 1 and 2, blocked in court. Travel ban 3 stands. And so a lot of it is kind of directives. There was the Buy American, Hire American executive order, which affected the H-1B program. So the president is doing some stuff. I think actually one of the biggest things that doesn't get enough coverage is the role of the attorney general. So as I mentioned briefly before, the attorney general is like judge, jury, and executioner when it comes to the immigration courts, because the immigration courts aren't like courts in the federal judiciary. They're basically bureaucrats, which by practice had been allowed to basically have a great degree of judicial independence, but by law very much respond to the attorney general. So I think if you guys go and research one thing, I would suggest researching USCIS policy memos, which is part of that's actually Department of Homeland Security, but also immigration courts, what he's been doing. Like, for example, with, limiting who can get asylum. So that one actually did get a little bit of coverage, but it was like, he decided that people that were fleeing domestic violence or gang violence no longer qualified for asylum. Things like that. And that was all Sessions. Whitaker hasn't done anything yet on that front. But I think that's one great way to get up to speed with some of the things that have actually happened. A lot of it is in DOJ. And the president's going to keep signing things. He's going to get sued. If public charge goes into effect, he's going to get sued immediately, probably get blocked. And that's just kind of it's this cat and mouse thing that's been going on this whole time. And so it's hard to say where all of this is going to pan out, because so much of it is litigation right now.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. Want to play us out?
Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, that's it for the NGP podcast today. Tune in next time. We're going to be talking about criminal justice. Thank you. Yeah. Woo.